Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those joining us from the UK. My name is Sophie Hare. I am a second year in the college, majoring in public policy and minoring in Spanish, and I currently work as the IOP Speaker Series intern. Thank you for joining us for this virtual conversation between IOP Director David Axelrod and the UK's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak. Chancellor Sunak has had quite an eventful past 2 years, having been appointed head of Her Majesty's Treasury by Prime Minister Boris Johnson just 1 month before COVID-19 hit the UK. Chancellor Sunak sprang into action with his country's biggest package of emergency state support since the 2008 financial crisis, and to date has deployed £280 billion to protect British jobs, keep businesses afloat, and help families get by. Following his appointment to Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mr. Sunak not only had to manage the financial implications of the pandemic, but also navigate the stormy waters of Brexit, for which he campaigned heavily during the EU referendum. Chancellor Sunak is the eldest son in a Hindu family that immigrated from India in the 1960s. Born and raised in the UK, the Chancellor studied philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford University before receiving his MBA from Stanford as a Fulbright scholar. Prior to his entrance on the UK's political stage, Chancellor Sunak worked in finance and in 2015 won his MP seat for Richmond in Yorkshire. Before heading Her Majesty's Treasury, Mr. Sunak served as Prime Minister May's Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Local Government, as well as Chief Secretary to the Treasury under Prime Minister Boris Johnson. David Axelrod will moderate this event. David is the founding director of the Institute of Politics, senior political commentator for CNN, and host of the well-known podcast, The Axe Files and Hacks on Tap. David previously served as chief strategist and senior advisor to President Barack Obama and spent 8 years as a reporter and columnist for the Chicago Tribune. Thanks again for tuning in, and please join me in giving a warm welcome and wishing a happy early birthday to our guest, Chancellor Rishi Sunak.
Thank you, Sophie. And I didn't even have in my notes that it was almost your birthday. So she informed me of something I didn't know. Happy birthday, whenever that is.
Thank you, David. That's kind.
So Sophie gave a little bit of your history. Your father was a physician, your mother a pharmacist. So naturally, you ended up in finance and politics. How did
So I didn't. What was that question, David? How did that happen?
Yes.
Yes. Well, it stems from a kind of community-oriented aspect, actually. So where I grew up, my dad is a family physician, and my mum ran a pharmacy, and they did pretty much the same thing in the same place their entire careers. And I worked for both of them, but mainly my mum in the pharmacy. So I grew up delivering medicines to elderly patients. And because they had done the same thing in the same place for so long, wherever I went, people would always talk to me about my mum and dad. And they'd always say, oh, you're Dr. Sunak's son, you're Mrs. Sunak's son. And then they would tell me some story about what my parents had done for either them or their parents or their kids. And that really stayed with me. And I thought it was incredible how just those two individuals could have such an impact on our community. And that was the inspiration for me for wanting to get into politics as a good constituency MP. And obviously, our model here in the UK are these very small districts where we're embedded in our local communities in quite a retail way. I thought, look, I couldn't do the medic thing, but I could do it that way. And funnily enough, actually, as an MP, as a member of parliament here in the UK, the average district is kind of 80,000, something like that. I have weekly surgeries. So like my dad, as a physician, I also have surgeries and people will come and see me. It's kind of office hours for your constituents. And, I help them work through problems. So that's where the inspiration came from.
Let me ask you, you're a British Indian. Your family your grandparents came over, as Sophie mentioned. Any barriers? I mean, you're a historic figure in that sense because you're the second most powerful person in the British government. Probably the first British Indian to hold that position. Any barriers along the way that you faced as a result of your background?
So if you think about, I think the things that, my grandparents had to deal with are obviously very different to what I've experienced. And look, of course I've experienced racism as a kid growing up, and of course I have, and of course it still exists in the UK. But if I think about the things that happened to me when I was a kid, the odd incidents, I can't imagine those happening today to my children. And I think that's a sign of the enormous progress that, we as a country, have made, not since I was a kid, obviously since my grandparents arrived. And the fact that I'm sitting here talking to you, yes, as the first British Indian, but actually the second British Asian to hold this job. My predecessor is a British Pakistani whose parents also emigrated here. So the fact that you've had two of us in this incredibly privileged job, I think speaks to, hopefully the meritocratic system that we have in the UK. And, is there always work to do? Of course, there's always work to do, and we want to all create a more perfect society. But I take enormous pride in the progress that our country's made. And I feel personally, it's part of my motivation also for being in politics, just personally grateful for what this country has done to my family. Ultimately, it welcomed them to the country, it integrated them, and allowed me to sit here talking to you. And, there are bumps in the road, of course there are. But, here I am, and I've got nothing but thanks for that.
Yeah, the reason this is of great interest to us over here because we're having a big national discussion about institutional racism, systemic racism. Is there such a thing in Britain? Do you see? You said there's racism, but do you see that in institutions there that needs to be addressed?
I don't see it that way, David. And actually, we're having a different debate here. We've just had a report that has looked at some of these issues and disparities in our society. And, actually shone a spotlight, for example, in education, where one of the social disparities that we see now is that of white working class boys in particular. Right. And actually, it's making sure that we focus policy everywhere that there's injustice or where we want to provide greater opportunity. And look, institutionally, everyone will have their own experience. In my experience, I haven't seen that. And of course, there are always individuals who are bad eggs. That doesn't colour a society. And as I think about the progress, as I talked about, the fact that I'm here talking to you, tells me we have a system that broadly is working. And Boris, to his enormous credit, I think we have the most ethnically diverse cabinet in British history since he's been Prime Minister, which again speaks to the change that has happened in our country.
Yeah, well, I take great pride in working for the first African-American president. And yes, that represented progress, but it didn't obviate, that needs to be done. And we've seen that in dramatic fashion here. You know a lot about America because you came here to Stanford to get your master's degree. We'll forgive you for not going to the University of Chicago. but we were talking before we started the program about what you learned from watching American politics, because you are a master of social media. That's how you're viewed in British politics. You've used it very creatively, very effectively. And you said before we started that was something that you gleaned from watching American politics.
Yeah, I mean, if you think, look, I probably learned a lot because of what you and your colleagues were all doing, and because I first moved to the States to Stanford in 2004, so that's when I started living there, and then ultimately left in 2013, right? So if you think that was, I think you and your team were probably responsible during that time for the creation of using digital campaigning effectively. And that's what I saw firsthand, right? And, whether it's, Sasha Eisenberg's book when it first came out and all the other things that followed. And to me here, it just seemed, look, we, as with many things, right? We can look to the US and see what we can emulate. And I think there's a hunger for people to have a direct connection with their politicians. And I think, look, we're in the business of communication, and me trying to communicate with different types of people to engage them in what I'm doing is an important part of my job. And not everyone sits down and watches the 6 o'clock news like they used to. And so if there are different people that otherwise I wouldn't be able to talk to that I can by doing something different and interesting, I think that's the right thing to do. They can hold me accountable. They can, probe me on it and know what's going on. So that's what I learned, when I was there, and hopefully it makes a difference here.
Tremendous tool. Do you have concerns as a leader about the misuse of social media, disinformation? We're dealing with the impacts of it here. Obviously, you felt some of it there. What do we do as leaders in society to deal with the hard edge of social media?
Yeah, look, it's a tricky question, and one, we've been grappling with the right form of regulation over here on the digital side, and we have something. If people are interested, I would urge you to have a look at it, because I think it's been broadly welcomed as a sensible middle ground, and it's something called, we've got an online harms paper, and we talk about this idea of online harms and where do we draw the line? What's the right set of people's right to express themselves and have free flow of information, but also what's the responsibility on the platforms who are carrying this information? And look, there's no perfect answer to this, but I think what we're doing is putting in place, we think, a regulatory system that is stronger than it was, protects people appropriately without making sure that we just don't entrench the advantage of incumbents or stop innovation happening, which I think we care about as well. But this online harms white paper sets out a regulatory framework, which I think goes some way to addressing these things. But look, it's going to have to be iterative, because this is all new, and we are all, to some extent, having to adapt as people's use of these platforms adapts as well.
And malign actors, this has become a challenge for democracies. So one that we need to pay attention to. You mentioned a regulation. You also spent years in finance. You were at Goldman. You were at a couple of other firms. You were there during the crash of 2007, 2008. One of your firms had issues related to that. What did you learn from all of that in terms of what is necessary about regulation, financial regulation, to prevent the kinds of problems that we had that really brought the whole world economy down in 2007, 2008?
Yeah. I mean, look, of course you need regulation, and what we all learned during that time is the regulation we had was not good enough to do the job we needed it to do, which is why all of us, whether it's in the UK, the US, subsequent to that, have put in place, new forms of regulation to protect people from the effects of banking crises. And that's ultimately, what happened, what you had to deal with, what we had to deal with here. And I think that the broad, of course, we need to have those, and we'll do that. But the worrying thing about that for me also was, as someone who believes in financial services as an industry, believes in the good that it can do, it believes in the importance of a free market and free enterprise economy, where you have a system where it appeared to the bulk of ordinary people, the system somehow wasn't for them and the wrong people getting rewarded, that isn't a good, healthy thing for those of us who believe in a free enterprise system. And you had to make decisions, government in the UK had to make decisions which appeared a bit odd to the average person, saying, hang on, you're spending how many hundreds of $1 billion on TARP or whatever it was, and I'm losing track, and what about my house that I'm getting foreclosed on? You needed to do those things because that was the right way to help that person at the end of the day. And, moral hazard and all the rest of it, and I've had to do some of the same in this crisis. You've got to act to solve the problem in a crisis. And actually, over time, people understand that, but it's not great when those things happen, and it undermines people's faith in the overall system, which we all believe in. So I think you need appropriate regulation to make sure people have long-term confidence in the system.
You've had this meteoric rise in politics. You just were elected in 2015, and now you're in your position. That's the good news. The bad news is, as Sophie mentioned, a month after you arrived came COVID, and there were disruptions relative to Brexit as well, complicated challenges. But COVID, knocked Britain for a loop, as it did every other country. And you've been very aggressive about interventions, not necessarily associated with Tory dogma, a lot of spending, much as we did here, to try and keep the economy from completely collapsing. Talk to me about that and the successes of it and the limits of it.
So, look, first of all, on the rise, which is kind of you to say, I think, look, ultimately, I'm very lucky that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, he took, let's be clear, right? I was relatively new, relatively inexperienced, and he placed this confidence and trust in me. And that's all, all to hopefully credit due to him, but time will tell. But that it was him that he decided to put his faith in me at that time, and that I will always be grateful to him for that, and hopefully continue to do a good job for him. Now, in terms of the crisis, I said right at the beginning, actually, look, we were dealing with something unprecedented. As you face when you're in a crisis, it's I think probably not the time for ideology and dogma. You've just got to look at the situation and do what government has to do at times of crisis. It's protect people, and in this case, protect businesses as well, because it was government that was going to force them to close for prolonged periods of time. And I think the most significant intervention we made was something called the Furlough Scheme, which we set up and then stressfully implemented in a record number of weeks with many sleepless nights, which allowed millions of people to stay attached to their workplaces, remain in their jobs, with largely the government picking up the tab on a reduced basis for that duration of time. And that was a deliberate choice. And it was a belief that, look, this would be a temporary crisis, longer than we've all thought at the beginning, but ultimately temporary. And once we could get through the health situation, the economy would be able to resume where it was for the most part. And because that was our diagnosis of the problem, building the bridge, protecting those jobs seemed to me to be the right thing to do, and would enable us to bounce back strongly, protect people's incomes and security in the interim. So that was a signature intervention we've made. At one point, a third of the UK workforce were on it. Everywhere I go, people will talk to me about it and the difference it made to them. And it's probably too early for the post-mortems to begin, but at the beginning of this crisis, people were expecting unemployment in the UK to go all the way up to 12, 14%, 1980s levels of unemployment, millions of people. And what's happened is currently unemployment is at 5%. And that is one of the lowest levels of unemployment amongst large economies. I think probably only Japan and Germany better than us currently. So, jobs has always been my main measure of focus. And on that score, although many people have lost their jobs, and that's tragic, and we're helping them find new ones, I'm glad that the damage has not been as significant as many people feared. And the interventions, I think, have played a role in that.
It's always more fun in politics to give than take away. And obviously you've spent in an unfunded way, as we have, in order to try and stave off the worst of the crisis. You're going to have to pull back. At what pace and speed, and what are the politics of that?
So, to some extent, I've already started talking to the country and implementing policies that enable us to get back to some semblance of normal fiscally. We've got a plan to phase and taper most of our interventions over the course of this year that's been announced. So that will happen naturally as we reopen the economy. We've made a couple of decisions on elements of public spending to help prioritize. One of them was not an easy one for me to make, was on public sector pay, where ordinarily wages in the public sector, which are set by government, would go up. They would be set by me. I took the decision. Look, in an environment where lots of people are losing their jobs, people in the private sector's wages are being cut, and we're worried about unemployment, I think we should have some restraint on public sector pay. So we put some mechanisms in place to restrain pay increases in the public sector. So that's not an easy thing to do, but people understood, I think. And then also on the tax side, I did a budget last month where, in order to help right the ship and make sure that we can continue to invest whilst having some, kind of, I think, broadly sensible fiscal metrics, I was just making a decision to put up corporation tax from 19 to 25%, and also to freeze income tax thresholds, which allow us to collect more tax revenue over time through fiscal drag, which is a progressive way to raise money from people. No chancellors like putting up taxes, right? So, those are the difficult decisions I've already had to make. I think, thankfully, the budget seemed to land well with the country, and people understood that we needed to do that. They thought what we were doing was fair, and I talked a lot about honesty and fairness. I wanted to be honest with the country about the challenges we faced, and fair in how we addressed them. And by and large, that seems to have landed well with the country. So look, we're on that journey. I'm not going to say it's going to be easy, but hopefully we've made good progress.
I'm sure you know that the President Biden is trying to do some of what you've done there. He wants to raise the corporate tax. He proposes 28. Others have talked about 25. But he's also proposed a global corporate minimum tax to try and avoid tax evasion by shopping for more tax-friendly markets. I saw yesterday that you said that you were open to that. How feasible do you think that is, and can you build the kind of alliance necessary to implement such a tax?
But this is something that we've been talking about for a long time amongst the G7 group of large economies. And since Janet has been Treasury Secretary, she's been great at engaging with us on there's two pillars that are pillar 2 is this global minimum tax that you're talking about. The other pillar, the other thing that we want to make sure we also get done is having a fairer taxation of large multinational digital companies. And for complicated reasons, there are international tax treaties that govern how we as individual countries tax the companies that are acting in our countries. Now, those tax treaties were originally designed in the 1920s, so they're not really fit for the modern digital economy. And therefore, I think most people would agree there isn't a fair divvying up of taxation where economic value is created. So what we're keen to do is redress that. And that's pillar 1 of the proposals that we're working through the OECD. And pillar 2 is a minimum tax. And what we've always been clear on, that we understand some people have more interest in pillar 2. Our priority is pillar 1, but they will come together as a package. And as long as we can get them all done together, that's the solution that we'd like to see.
Getting together with the G7 finance ministers in June, so presumably this will be high on the agenda.
Yes, that's right. I mean, previously, as a group of international countries, we've committed to trying to get this resolved by the middle of this year at the G20 meetings, which happen a bit later than the G7 meetings. And as I say, Janet, since she got the job, has been engaged with this, which has been great. There's a lot of people working very hard on the technical detail of this through at the OECD, as you would imagine. But I remain optimistic that we can find a solution. And on something like digital taxation, it's a good example of it requires multilateral cooperation, which it's great that that's back in action. And normally when you do these big summit things and international treaties, they don't have that much resonance to the typical person who I represent. But on the issue of digital taxation, it really does. And it's probably trickier for an American audience to get this. But if most European countries would say, hang on, we've got all these wonderful companies that we enjoy using all their products. We just think it's reasonable that they pay their fair share in our countries. And as long as that's happening, that's great. And it's not happening currently, and they want to see that fixed. And that's a particularly political issue that many of us are grappling with.
I have to ask you this because news, you've been touched by controversy because David Cameron, the former Prime Minister, personally lobbied you for aid for a financial firm with which he was involved, and they did get aid. This has created quite a stir. There were messages back and forth between you and Cameron. Was that a mistake? Was it a mistake to engage personally with Cameron on a commercial issue like that?
So, as anyone in my job or as a department, you get lots of inbound from lots of people, and I'm sure again you would have had this. Well, yeah, that may be the case. So I think what the important thing is in a financial crisis, if you remember the context, so one of the major issues that we were all grappling with actually as finance ministers was how do we get credit flowing to small and medium-sized businesses, right? It was a major focus of all of us. And every single country had multiple, and we're all comparing notes, and what was the best way to provide some government guaranteed set of lending and credit to small and medium-sized companies. And that was an acute crisis, actually. And this was one of the many strands of work that we pursued. There was a company with a particular type of financing called supply chain financing. They were keen to access one of our existing facilities. We went through multiple iterations of looking at different ways that might be a good idea or not. It was one strand of work in lots of other things that we were doing. And ultimately, we thought that was not something that we were going to pursue, and lots of other interventions, which got off to a difficult start, and we had to iterate them, ultimately ended up working well. And we had some government-backed loan schemes that have ultimately been successful. But it was right in a crisis to go through the process of diligencing it, and ultimately right not to take it forward.
Don't the success of these programs also rely on public confidence, though? And isn't it best to have rigorous sort of standards so that no one can backdoor or end run the process?
Yeah, and that's what we have. And ultimately, these aren't individual loans to individual companies. What these are financing schemes that benefit. Our largest scheme has benefited over 1 million small businesses, which is sizable for our country. And so and what the proposal was a scheme that would have helped many businesses, and there would have been many companies that could have used it. But ultimately, it wasn't workable, and we didn't think it would achieve what we needed to achieve, and we could do that elsewhere.
To take Cameron's call on this?
I think it's absolutely appropriate to, when people have ideas that they come to us with, we rightly diligence them as we should, and particularly in a financial crisis. I don't think you would want to be ears closed to ideas that would help get credit to companies at a time when that was the #1 pressing issue that we were grappling with. But look, there's a process for all of that, and our civil service were involved throughout the process. And everything is documented in that way. So in that sense, there's due process that's always followed, and ultimately the decision was not to proceed.
Tomorrow, the Scottish parliamentary elections will be held, elections in Britain as well. Widely expected that the Scottish National Party will prevail and win a majority there, and that's going to lead to a request, likely lead to a request for another referendum on Scottish independence. After Brexit, which the Scots opposed in large numbers, there was more momentum behind this. The Prime Minister says he won't grant such a referendum. Doesn't that change the kind of relationship between Scotland and Britain to refuse them a referendum?
So, David, forgive me, I probably won't preempt the election results. I know people like to speculate on them, but we have them tomorrow. Let's see what happens. But look, I genuinely think, and actually I've just been in Wales this morning, and I've just come back from Wales campaigning there. And look, what do people want to talk to me about, and what do they broadly want to talk to us all about? It's can you get the vaccine rolled out the way you're doing, which they're really happy with? Can you get the country and the economy safely reopened? And then can you focus on our jobs and then on the day-to-day public services that we provide? Now, that's what most people's priority is. I don't think they're particularly interested in constitutional questions and more referendum and all of that. We've just come through this unbelievable crisis collectively as a country, and it's demonstrated that actually in the darkest hours, our family of nations in the United Kingdom is stronger when it's together. The vaccine rollout was a great example of that. The Furlough Scheme, which has protected millions of jobs across the UK, is an example of that. And now we want to just deal with the remaining stages of this crisis and look forward. And I don't think that's anybody's focus, to be perfectly honest.
When I thought about this question, I thought, how would I answer if I were you? And you didn't disappoint. I think you gave a very good and polished and wise answer to that question. I thought I'd give it a try anyway. I'm sure there'll be many questions about Brexit from the students. I will defer those. So let me just finish here. The Prime Minister, to whom you paid tribute earlier, and thanks, is in some degree of trouble politically. He's underwater. I know you're not seeking to oust him. You work with him. But to borrow a phrase that you've heard before, if the ball should come from the back of the scrum in your direction, are you ready to lead? Do you see yourself as Prime Minister down the line?
To be honest, I'm more a football fan than a rugby fan. But in any case, my football, not your football. But I like your football too, especially when they're doing well. But you talk about jobs, and we talked about it earlier. But the thing that keeps me most up at night, the job that it's people's jobs, right? 800,000 people, it's almost 1 million people in the UK have lost their jobs since the beginning of this crisis. And my overriding goal is to try and make sure as fewer people as possible lose their jobs and as many of those people can get back into work as quickly as possible. And that's the job that I'm focused on, that the Prime Minister's focused on, and the rest of the government. And we've got a task ahead, right? Like you guys, we're getting our vaccine rolled out, and then we've got to get everyone back into work and get things back to the way they were. And everyone in government is united around that purpose. And as I said, we're lucky to have Boris's leadership, and I'm very privileged to serve under him.
Well, we're going to keep our eye on you as time goes on here, because as will, I think, most people who watch politics in Britain, for reasons that should be apparent just from this half-hour conversation. But we want to take some questions from students, and the first question will come from Bala, a student at Booth, the school that you should have attended but didn't, Chancellor. And Bala, step up here and ask your question.
Thank you, David. Hello, Chancellor. It's a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Hi, Bala.
For doing this. And yeah, surely miss you at Booth. My question is about the post-Brexit economy. I'm sure you've read predictions about economists, predicting that the economic growth is going to halve over the next 10 years because of the no-deal Brexit. I'm curious what your and the broader Conservative government's plans are to counter that.
So, Bala, first things first is we got a deal. So there is no-deal Brexit. That, as the Prime Minister said, that we would get a deal. We've got a deal, and we've got the most comprehensive and deep and expansive trade deal that I think any two entities have ever signed, right? It's 100% zero tariff, zero quota deal. And there are basically no real other examples of that between such large economies. So it's a very deep trade deal. And that's good news, because the EU is a large trading partner of the UK. But what does post-Brexit Britain's economy look like? Well, first of all, one of the great advantages we have is now that we can also sign trade deals with lots of other countries around the world. And that's exciting, because if you look at where the growth is, it is in lots of other places. So the EU used to account for about 50% of our exports a decade ago. That's down to 40% and falling. It's right that as I think about my kids and the next generation, where is Britain likely to be exporting to in 20 years from now? Where are those growth markets? How can we deepen our ties with those? Which is why we're engaged in CPTPP, right? Which I think you guys will decide in the US what you want to do on that. That represents something that we couldn't do before that we now can do. I think the other example I would point to you to is regulation. And I think what this pandemic has shown is that, and we talked about appropriate regulation, you need good regulation, but that regulation can work in a nimble, flexible, innovative manner. So whether that's making sure that the UK remains the best place to do fintech, which it currently is, and that's a growing industry, or indeed life sciences, whether it's genomic sequencing or some of the other innovations that you've seen, our ability to have control of our regulatory system, I think, is a competitive advantage for us. So, I think those are some of the things that we can do a little differently. And okay, it won't all happen overnight. It's a process over time. But that's where I see some of the opportunity.
Thank you, Bala. Rocco, student from the college.
Yes, hi, Chancellor. Thank you so much for coming here to and answer our questions. I'm calling in from Los Angeles. I'm actually an incoming student at the college. And my question is, the pandemic has obviously caught us off guard. And so what have you as Chancellor, as a leader, learned about crisis management from dealing with the pandemic? And how has this pandemic fundamentally changed the way that the UK government is preparing for future crises, pandemic or not?
Great. Whereabouts in LA are you?
I'm in the San Fernando Valley.
Oh, nice. So my old home, but more Santa Monica than San Fernando. But right. So crisis management. Look, I mean, David, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this as well. What do I learn? I mean, one is just that you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, because you just don't have the luxury of time. I mean, anyway, that's a good rule, but if ever that's true, it's in a crisis, right? And as we talked about before, things like moral hazard and all the rest of it, like they're just not the right considerations, repercussive risk, like that. You've got to kind of get out of that mindset because you're in firefighting mode. And that means you have to just think differently about the intervention. Speed is really important. And I think the other thing from an economic perspective is I probably underestimated the importance of communication. And look, I was new to the job, and I didn't sense. Look, ultimately, what I say matters, and just the act of saying things and saying what you're going to do can provide confidence and reassurance to people, and it's important to remember that, right? So having a process that looks organized, looks like the people in control have a grip. And one thing that I think we did well here in the UK at the beginning that the IMF and others talked about was our central bank and fiscal arm, the Treasury Me. It looked like, obviously there are independent institutions, but we were acting in a way that felt to the country like, look, they're acting in sync, they're coordinating, they're talking to each other, there's a coherent plan, and that provides confidence beyond the measures itself. So, those are a couple of quick reflections. But in terms of going forward, I think it's the speed. I think the one thing, if you talk to Boris about it, what he would probably tell you as well is it's just the ability to make things happen fast. That's what we want to try and carry forward. We've had to do that in a crisis, but there's no reason why actually we should accept that it takes a year to get X done or 2 years to get Y done. We've all figured out how to get things done very quickly. So how much of that can we keep to the benefit of our citizens?
I'm going to read a question. Thank you, Rocco. and look forward to seeing you on campus. I'm going to read a question from Luke, and it is, with Boris Johnson talking more about a green industrial revolution and tackling climate change, what would be your role in promoting that? And I know that you've been in consultation with your fellow finance ministers on this very subject.
Luke, great question. So the PM had outlined a 10-point plan last year, which I think is actually worth reading the document that came along with it, because I think it's quite a good comprehensive approach to the problem and setting out what we're going to do. And I won't go over it here now, but this is obviously one of the great challenges that we face. And I think the interesting thing for me now being in this job is you think, 2050, gosh, is that going to be someone else's problem? No, it's not, right? Because the decisions we make now are going to impact whether we hit net zero by 2050 or not. So it's important we get them right. Now, obviously, we're doing a lot of things domestically. I think the key thing politically, what I would say is that this can't be some high level thing that only happens at international summits. It has to be connected to ordinary people's lives. And that's why the emphasis on jobs and talking about it as an industrial revolution is important. And look, we've got to figure out how do we make this sing for ordinary people. So can we create new green jobs in places that previously were quote unquote left behind, where we want to level up? There's an area near where I represent, which used to be an old steel community, which is, there's a port there, but that area is being reinvented as a place where we can do carbon capture and storage, offshore wind, which is a great UK competitive advantage, and potentially hydrogen. Now it needs to be about that. It needs to be about jobs, I think, for people, is one point I'd make. And then to David's point, there's a lot of work internationally we have to do, and it's kind of geeky and techie, but it's important. We need to mobilize probably trillions of dollars in finance to make this transition happen. We can't get that capital moving unless investors have the right disclosure framework in order to figure out, well, what's green, what's not green. So, one of my tasks this year is to get lots of other countries to agree to what we've done in the UK, which is to have mandatory climate disclosures by 2025. And we did that, announced that last year. I'm working with, Janet Yellen and others across the G7, the G20 to try and make that an international agreement, because that's the only way we can mobilize the capital we need and ultimately get it to the emerging economies where it needs the most in order to make the transition. So that's one of my to-dos for this year.
Thanks. Thanks so much. I want to just follow up quickly, and then we have another question. We dealt with this when I was in government. It's still part of the debate today. The short-term economic sacrifices that people are being asked to make in order to serve the goal of climate. One of the talking points of those who oppose climate action has been, well, the Chinese are the biggest emitters, and how do we compel them to match our actions? And if they're not, why should we? And I'm wondering how you react to that argument.
Yeah, it really helps that the US is now demonstrating leadership on this issue, right? And President Biden, I think it was a week ago, when we had the summit, and you've seen obviously a change in approach with the new administration. That's really helped in all these international conversations. We are chairing COP this year, the big summit at the end of the year, and we're doing that together with Italy. And John Kerry is playing a huge role in that as well, obviously. And look, we have to show leadership, otherwise it's hard to ask anyone to do anything. And that's why I think it's important on us to do that, to set an example. But your point, David, is right. Asking people to sacrifice is not easy. And so we have to make this. We have to make sure that people connect this with an agenda that they think is positive, right? If it's all kind of hair shirting, I have to give up everything I'm used to, and this is just going to cost me a fortune. I think that would be tough, right? But this has to be an agenda where we can figure out, well, what are the opportunities for us? Pick another one, right? Which is, we talk about a little bit post-Brexit, financial services, the City of London. It's an important part of our economy. So carbon offset trading is going to, I think, be quite a big deal, right? And we currently trade only about 1% of carbon emissions. That can be really helpful in the transition. I see no reason why the UK, London, can't be the place where that happens a lot. Now, Chicago, you guys have good form in commodities trading as well, so you might want a piece of that action. But that's an area where, look, we're going at it. We're trying to set up the right infrastructure for the market to develop here. That will create jobs, right, ultimately, and help the carbon transition. And by the way, help countries, whether it's India or China, because it will help channel funds from developed economies to those other places that need the money and have the carbon offsetting projects. So I think there's lots of interesting things we can do, but we've got to remain centered on, look, how can I sell this and communicate it to a person that I represent at home in North Yorkshire or on Teesside? Otherwise it's just a bunch of people flying around at international summits, right? Which is not ultimately going to be successful domestically.
Incidentally, this is a non sequitur, and we won't talk about it here, but if I had more time, I'd love to hear you talk about Britcoin and the possibility of digital currency, which I know you've talked about and you're exploring. But I want to get to Shure, who has a question for you. Shure, I don't know exactly where in the university you are.
So yeah, I'm an incoming first year this year, and as a British Indian, it's honestly a great honor to talk to you, Mr. Sunak.
Oh, it's kind, Shure. How are you?
Now, right? I'm well. Right now, I'm in Delhi. In, not too late, luckily. So my question is, it kind of surrounds the entire idea of, kind of built on the idea of managing crises. So you earlier mentioned the furlough scheme, and you had, the phrase viable jobs had been thrown around a bit, and it caused a little bit of debate. So my question to you is, how exactly do you approach the challenge of balancing, long-run economic development goals and mitigating the current crisis?
Yeah, well, first of all, Sure, I hope you and your family are okay and coping in what is obviously a very difficult situation. So, look, funny enough, I was actually I was doing a bit of part-time teaching of an A-level economics class actually, funny enough, I don't know if Gretchen's still on the call, but it was an art school where Gretchen's husband, it sounds like, was involved in one of those. So I was at one of these schools just last week, and that was the first question the student asked me. And he's like, how do you balance, protecting jobs with allowing the adjustment that an economy ordinarily needs in order to grow and maintain its productivity? And look, it's a great question. And it goes back to what's the right, there's peacetime policies and then there's crisis, wartime policies. And look, I think the balance in a crisis, given it was a particular crisis where we think it was a temporary disruption and the job fundamentally would still exist at the other end of the crisis, that the balance is to protect the job that exists. And that's what the furlough scheme does. It's a job protection scheme. But look, as the economy reopens, it's clear that, that is probably not that is not the right long-term solution, right? I don't think anyone thinks that it should be a permanent feature of the economy. So what you want to do is make sure the incentives are aligned as the economy is reopened. And the way we are doing that here is by introducing an employer contribution, right? Because that then allows some degree of the market to function where, look, if the job is one where it's clearly never going to come back, by making the employer contribute to the scheme, it crystallizes the decision for the employer, and it means that you're protecting the jobs that are more likely to still be there. And it means, for those people who are not going to be able to go back to the jobs that they had, because not everyone is, we should then focus our attention on those people with reskilling, upskilling, new opportunities, because the worst thing is for them to be sitting there for months on end, assuming they can walk back to their job, get no help, and then find out the job is not there. We're not doing them any favors. So the employer contribution for the economists on the call is our way of trying to balance the incentives that you're talking about.
Chancellor, thank you so much, Shura, for your question, and look forward to seeing you on campus. Chancellor, I'm delighted to have spent this time with you. It's been a pleasure. I look forward to conversations in the future. And as I said, you are someone to watch, and we will be watching. And so thank you for sharing this time with us at a very busy time for you.
David, thank you. Sophie, thank you. And thanks all of you for your questions, which were fantastic. I hopefully get to see you in person at some point in the future.
Look forward to it. Thank you.